What do you think the stories that we tell indicate about the culture we live in? And I use the royal we as in people in general.
Yeah. I mean, that's a pretty universal question because it depends on what culture you're in, when that culture is taking place, and a whole lot of other factors. But it is a pretty universal answer as well. I think all cultures tell stories, and the stories that those cultures tell really say more about those cultures than maybe anything else. Even the archaeological record, if you're going way back, one of the best indicators of where that culture is in their, rather, where that culture understands itself to be within the narrative. The best place to look is the stories that they tell about themselves, um, about those around them, who they consider the others to be, and why, and who they consider to be insular to that culture. So, yeah, the stories that we tell ourselves, broadly speaking, I would say that communicates more platonic reality, right? Reality that's outside of even our understanding, um, but in a sense more realistic than anything else that we experience day to day. Our stories get to the root of that matter more quickly than anything else.
Now, when you say outside, do you mean like an objective perspective or just a perspective that's, mm, I guess, universal to that specific society?
Well, so Plato would say that there exists truth beyond anything that we're able to attain in this reality, and that anything that we do here is basically an approximation of that truth. And we can get really close, and we can know what we're talking about, right? We can know what a square is. We can know what a circle is. We can describe these platonic solids, if you will, by very real means. But at the end of the day, we're still circumscribing the actual truth that exists beyond. And I think that's importantly one of the roles that stories play, is they help us approximate that truth, that higher truth that exists beyond anything that we could ever experience or imagine, but we know is there somewhere. Our stories give us a unique ability to get as close to that truth as we ever can, because we know it's out there, and we know the best we can do is approximate it. And the way that we approximate that truth is through storytelling. Whether it is day to day and you're telling your coworker how your weekend was, and you skip over a couple of details that don't matter. Why don't they matter? You emphasize some details that do matter to the story of how your weekend went, because in the context of telling your coworker how that weekend was, you are giving them the story of how your weekend was, not the play-by-play, not what actually happened, but what was meaningful to you and what you understand to be meaningful to your audience. A communications major would say that the message has to be, first of all, you have to think of what you're going to say, right? But it has to be encoded, it has to be transmitted, it has to be decoded, and it has to be received. And through that process, you're inherently changing what and how you say based on the audience you're speaking to, based on the medium you're using to make that communication. And a storyteller would describe that process in a very similar way, because all of those things matter to the story. You're going to describe how your weekend went to one coworker a completely different way than you will to another, because it's the story, it's the truth you're approximating via the dirty, difficult, incomplete, imperfect mechanisms of even just language that I'm struggling to use even to communicate with you now. It's not perfect, but I'm describing something that is perfect. It is real. It is the only thing that's real. It is the truth. And so anything that I tell you has to be an approximation of that truth. And I think that's where stories come in.
I think that's a pretty interesting perspective and take. And I want to push the analogy a bit farther because it kind of sounds like, the events that happen in our regular day it's almost like data, right? It's just a bunch of things that happened, and stories are concentrating that into what you said, the meaningful parts, at least in our context. And that's kind of interesting because, you would tell your story about your day differently depending on who you talk to, right? Because it's all about the context, right? The way you would tell your day to your mom versus your coworker versus, your kid are going to be completely different because what's meaningful is separate from the truth, like what actually happened.
It's separate from what is.
I want to pivot a little bit to the media that we consume as let's just stick with the West, America. So like the TV that we watch, the videos that we watch, the social media that we use, because even though they're all different formats, they're still avenues of storytelling. So I'm curious what you think. What our current consumption of media and stories is saying about us.
Well, man, this question in particular, I think I'm going to answer probably a little bit more biased than what I tried to get to with the previous question, because I'm coming at it from a perspective where our culture is aware of a problem, but unaware of the solution. And one of the solutions that we've approximated is filling in a gap with these other stories. I think that as a society, without getting on my soapbox too much, we're more distant than we have been in the past, and we're more distant from each other than we know to be the healthiest equilibrium that we could be in. If you look at the distant past, or even if you just look at the trend as you go backwards in time, both would indicate that our societies were structured more around community than they have been towards modernity or towards whatever direction we're headed. And I think that stories help fill a gap that we're very aware of subconsciously, and we attempt to solve that gap through what may be subconscious desires, such as, literally, when you go on some social medias and you try to see what your friends are up to, the platform of social media that's hosting that person's day-to-day or whatever they felt was important to share with whoever, a lot of platforms call that their story, okay? I don't think that's a coincidence. I think we're, to some very deep level, we are still aware of this gap that we are not okay with, because we are very social creatures. For almost all of human existence, we've lived in, compared to metropolitan cities of today, villages, essentially. Even the biggest cities, you knew everyone on your block, and you worked together on whatever. The apartment I'm in right now, I couldn't tell you the names of any of my neighbors, and I don't like that. I would love to do something about that, but I don't know what time they get home from work. I don't know what their day-to-day is, and if they can take on any more responsibilities or any more relationships. And so I don't want to bother them. And in a lot of ways, I can't bother them with my friendship or whatever. And so I fill that gap through other means. And I've gotten off social media completely in the last couple of years because at some point I realized that it wasn't actually making any more meaning in my life. The connections I was making were not meaningful, and the actions that I was taking with those connections were not meaningful. So I pursued other meaning in other places, other stories with other people who were real, or a closer approximation of real than social media. Again, this is all an example, but I think that it is a good indicator of where we are as a society currently, where we know we want to be, and the steps that we're trying to take to get there. And I think it's healthy to have this discourse and to try to find a closer approximation of that truth. And honestly, I don't know what it is. I don't know how we bridge that gap and how we get closer to our real communities, whether they're communities of distance and convenience, like my apartment, or whether they're communities of similar minds coming together for joint ventures, such as you and I are partaking in right now. And I would love to hear your thoughts, impromptu as they may be, on this particular issue, because I don't know how to fit in this gap of real societal loneliness that I think many of us feel in the stories that we tell each other day to day.
I think that you're definitely onto something, and I like the way that you brought up the point about social media's stories, right? Whatever's on the front page is their story. I think that's a great point. I never really thought about it before. And I think the loneliness epidemic,
yeah,
I mean, it definitely has a large relationship with social media. And I think a big part of that is the story that we tell ourselves on social media, right? You see people's highlights.
Yeah.
You see the highlights of their lives, and it creates a story. It creates a tale, essentially, of, oh, I went to Cabo, and then I went to Dubai, and then I went to the south of Spain. Mm-hmm. And I was actually just talking with a friend recently about mm-hmm. this, and they were like, yeah, but they don't post their bank statement after those trips. They don't post them getting back to their normal life and being like, wow, that was exhausting, all that travel, or just a vapid expense, you know what I mean, to post on social media.
Yeah.
And I've definitely heard that experience before, where, not specific to social media, but just being so focused in not the moment, trying to capture something, whether it's through social media or just being nervous maybe in a different context, where you don't even remember you were there. Like your only evidence that you had were there are those pictures, because you didn't take any time to take deep breaths and enjoy the spaces you were in.
Right.
And I think that people compare their normal lives, which I mentioned earlier, it's just data. It's just a bunch of things that happened, right? And on any given day, like, sure, there's a string of events that are related, because you go to work and work-related things happen. You come home, home-related things happen, but it's not exactly the same as a story.
Right.
And when you're on social media, you get a curated experience. Life is not a curated experience. You can do lifestyle design and choose somewhat the things you want to do on a daily basis. But in comparison to what's filmed for you to consume, it doesn't even come close to comparing. And the comparison is the thief of joy, right? We're gonna sit here with our normal lives, or maybe even above average. I mean, compared to the world, much above
Amazing.
average lives, and be like, Well, I don't have a
I'm
Lamborghini,
depressed.
and it looks like all these 17-year-olds have Lamborghinis.
Right.
So,
Little do you know, they're renting them for a day to promote this lifestyle that is unattainable for them, but to create the curated content that their followers, or who they think will be their followers, if it's on speculation, you're only going to see, like you said, this curated aspect of reality, which is ironically the opposite of an approximation of the truth. In fact, it's actually an act of deception. And sadly, what that's going to create in you, and this is really the main reason I got off social media, it's going to cause you to go, I need to create and curate my story for the people in this virtual community, right? Because in a real sense, it is a community, but in the realist sense, it is not a real community. It is a community of lies for us and by us. And that's the part that I said, I don't want to participate in this. It's not a holier than thou. I've got better stuff to do. I'm doing so great that I don't want to come down to your level and share with you. It was a recognition that this wasn't healthy for me or for others, and I just didn't want to participate in that process, because it is driven by the right things, a desire to fit in, a desire to have community and culture, and to share with others those things. But it is going about it in exactly the wrong way, in a way that actually destroys those things.